Hey guys, Dark Skeleton here, and today we're going to be covering the latest 5 cards in the Blackrock Mountain Adventure set. And I think today is when things are really going to start to get interesting, because as our first card up, we have Nefarian. Now I'm sure all of you are hardcore WoW nerds enough to know that Nefarian was the final boss in Blackwing Lair, the second 40-man instance, or raid rather, in the original vanilla World of Warcraft. Now, I never got to do that fight personally, but I know he's a bit of a badass. He's the son of Deathwing and the sister of Onyxia. Now, enough of the backstory, back to the card. Nefarian is a 9-mana 8/8 dragon with the battle cry to randomly add 2 spells from your opponent's class list to your hand. Now, really strangely there, it's not your opponent's deck list, not the cards they have in the deck, but any spell that your opponent's class can cast. That means when you play Nefarian, really strange things are going to happen. Now you can compare this guy really closely to Neptulon, which adds 4 random Murloc cards to your hand. But something to consider is that Murloc cards, on average, aren't really all that powerful. But spell cards are class cards, and class cards are always pretty good. Almost always. Cobra Shot? No. Don't play Cobra Shot. But overall, this card is really good in 2 ways. Firstly, it's already a good card because getting 2 random spells is good card value that'll keep you going in the late game. If you can play Nefarian successfully, it's going to be a card that keeps you in the game. And that also applies if he gets removed immediately by BGH or something like that, because you still have those 2 random spell cards. One of the main things that determines if a high mana cost legendary is good or not is if it does something on the turn it comes out. But then, on top of that, you add in the fact he's a dragon, which means all these dragon synergy cards that you've seen, and we're going to see with the future cards I'm going to discuss in this video, you can pull off that synergy. And with a card like Nefarian, I would say it's pretty justified. I think Nefarian is going to be a card that gets played in a lot of control decks. The main thing to consider about playing Nefarian is that he's a really slow card, and you have to consider, can you justify playing a card that's this slow in a deck so that you can ensure you have a late game, but then by playing cards like this, you'll be really weak against the aggressive early game. So that's the main thing you gotta look at. Next up, we have the Blackwing Corrupter, which is a very strong card in any dragon decks. You look at its stats, it's a 5/4, which is pretty bad, but of course, any card like that, you look at its battle cry effect. And its battle cry effect is to deal 3 damage if you're holding a dragon, which isn't really that difficult of a requirement. You can compare this guy to a fire elemental, which everybody knows is one of the best shaman cards, if not one of the best 6-drops in the game, period. Now, of course, Blackwing Corrupter is a 5-cost minion that has 1 less attack and 1 less health, which is totally reasonable and would probably put it in the same power level as a fire elemental, except that you have to be holding a dragon. So this card is really akin to a fire elemental, but it requires you to be playing those dragon decks. Now, of course, if you play games on a regular basis, then you know that mech mages love to throw out those Goblin Blast mages, which have 5/4 stats for 4 mana, randomly deal 4 damage across all enemy minions, and those are a real staple card in those decks, but they only work if you're playing a mech deck. In the same way, Blackwing Corrupter is going to be a staple dragon deck card. I cannot currently imagine a dragon deck that does not run 2 Blackwing Corrupters. Expect to see a lot of these guys being played as the new adventure set rolls around. Next, we have the Draconid Crusher, which is a 6-mana 6/6, not absolutely terrible stats as a base, but then as a battle cry, if your opponent is at 15 or less health, it gets +3/+3, making it a 9/9, which is utterly ridiculous for 6 mana, plus it's a dragon. Now, there are a lot of things that are interesting about this card. Having your opponent at a lower life total suddenly becomes significantly more valuable than it does for any turn that you're not just trying to finish your opponent off. Getting that +3/+3 stat buff is huge when you can play this guy. Another thing is that it's a 6-mana minion, but it's a 6-mana minion that can do well in aggressive decks, because aggressive decks are very likely to get your opponent down to 15 or less health by turn 6. Now, I don't know if a guy like this could make it into something like Face Hunter, which historically only plays 3 mana or less cards. But the potential is there. Getting a 9/9 out on turn 6 would be insane, in any event except for it getting BGH'd. Or Shadow Word Death, but if you count that as a weakness, then almost every other big card also has that weakness. There's another side of the equation, though, where you play a very slow dragon deck, And then sooner or later, you Alex draws to your opponent's face, putting them at 15 life, or you've just whittled your opponent down in a control-on-control matchup where both of you are just trading card for card, and somewhere along the lines, your opponent takes enough residual damage to get down to that 15 life total. Then in that instance, you can throw these Draconid Crushers out on the field in the following turns, which pose such a huge threat that it might just be enough to tip the favor onto your side in that control versus control matchup. I definitely think the dragon theme really supports the idea of big stompy creatures that if they get rolling, if they get out on the board, they should just be unstoppable. And I think that side, where you play Draconid Crusher in the late game, kind of supports that theme. But as I mentioned, it's also possible in aggressive decks because it revolves around your opponent's life, which aggressive decks are really, really good at lowering. Though in fairness, if you're waiting on any 6-mana minions to finish the game, then your deck may be drifting more towards mid-range rather than aggression. I'm definitely excited for this guy, and I want to see where he fits in with the new meta. Now for these last two cards, I put them together because they benefit from this same effect of having minions die on the field this turn makes the cards cheaper to play. So the first one up is the Volcanic Drake, which is a 6-mana 6/4, normally terrible, but if you can kill enough things on the field, then it becomes cheap to play. For instance, if you trade 2 minions into your opponent's 1 big guy, then it becomes a 3-mana 6/4, which is actually pretty good stats. However, I'm really skeptical about cards that require a lot of setup. It's the reason Kel'Thuzad isn't a game-breaking card, because your opponent, if they're playing smartly or anything but a face hunter, is probably going to be clearing out most of your field as the turns go by, so that you don't overwhelm them, of course, making efficient trades one of the most important things to do in Hearthstone. So for this to really work, you either have to have a spell backing it up on a very late game turn, or you have to have 2 minions on the field to really put it down to that 3 mana cost where it's effective. A 4 mana 6/4 that's situational to play like that isn't really that good. And as a result, I think this creature can work, but it will need a very specific kind of deck. What comes to mind first off would be something like Unleash the Hounds. If you can unleash into, say, 2 or 3 creatures, kill them all off with all of your hounds, then the Volcanic Drake potentially could become a 1, 2, or even 0 cost mana minion. And his stats prioritize that aggressive play style as well, prioritizing attack over health. So in general, either decks that have punishment options like Unleash the Hounds, or go for those weak minions and then try to make trades on your opponent's minions anyway, like a Cult Master deck, are probably where this guy's going to be seen. Definitely not a card that's going to make it into every deck, though I do see hunters experimenting with cards like this down the road. Lastly, we have Dragon's Breath, which is a 5-mana mage spell that does 4 damage. Sounds terrible? Well, yes it is, generally. Unless you can already kill off enough creatures on either side of the board during that turn to reduce the mana costs. Just like the Volcanic Drake, for every minion that died earlier this turn, it reduces the cost of the spell by 1. That means for this card to be played effectively, it needs to be played in some kind of strange board trading deck. Mech Mage, something similar to that, is possible, because Mech Mages run cards like Piloted Shredder, which trade very well and can just kind of dominate the average enemy field. If you mix a deck similar to that with cards like Cult Master, then you can trade your cards in, get cards into your hand, and then if you reduce Dragon's Breath enough, you can maybe play it as a 1 or 2 mana spell in ideal circumstances, and get an extra 4, or if you have 2 of them, 8 damage onto your opponent or your opponent's creatures. It's good when you can ensure that you're going to have a good field setup to make this card work, and utterly terrible in any other circumstance. As a result, this card's going to be really niche, as a lot of these Blackrock Mountain adventure cards are, but it'll fit in somewhere, I'm sure. It's not terrible in theory. I just think it'll be hard to pull off in practice. Anyway, I've been Dark Skeleton. I hope you enjoyed taking a look at these 5 new Blackrock Mountain adventure cards with me. If you have any questions, go ahead and leave them in the comments section, and I'll see you all next time.